Hello everyone, and welcome to this Diablo 3 video. Today we're going to be showcasing the Demon Hunter Shadows Mantle set for Season 27. This particular build uses the season-specific powers obtained from Angelic Crucibles and is only available during Season 27. If you're familiar with playing the normal Shadows Mantle build, this version is a different playstyle altogether, more akin to Whirlwind Barbarian and Tempest Rush Monk. It is extremely powerful and loads of fun, so definitely check this build out before the season ends. So up front, let's take a look at the set bonuses so we know what we're working with. The 2-piece set bonus, while equipped with a melee weapon, your damage is increased by a lot of percent. The key thing here is that we need to use a melee weapon. The 4-piece set bonus, Shadow Power gains the effect of every rune and lasts forever. Shadow Power is one of the skills that we can use, so we'll definitely want to use this to benefit from all the runes, which we'll go through later. And then for the 6-piece bonus, Impale deals additional weapon damage to the first enemy hit, and to a lesser degree, additional damage to subsequent enemies hit. The key thing here is that we need to use Impale. I wouldn't worry too much right now about the subsequent enemies piece and the first enemy hit. The key takeaway is that Impale is our main damage dealing attack, and that's what we'll want to use. So kind of in summary, really simply, use a melee weapon, use Shadow Power, use Impale. That's it. You don't need to worry about any funky set mechanics. You don't have to master anything that's different. You just have to use that stuff. And so next, let's take a look at the gear, and we'll first start off with the weapon. So because the 2-piece bonus requires us to use a melee weapon, we want to make sure that we've got one. We're going to be using Carlay's Point. This is basically the only option for us to use. It's the only melee weapon that will buff Impale damage, so it perfectly syncs up with the set. Carlay's Point, the legendary power, is that the damage of Impale is increased by a certain percentage, so we get a damage multiplier, and it returns 15 hatred if it hits an enemy that's already been hit by Impale, which is an important mechanic to understand. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but that's what this dagger has to offer. Now, in Season 27, there is a special item that drops that's called an Angelic Crucible. This drops as a consumable, and you go and you ID it just like you would a normal piece of gear. These drop nominally from anywhere as far as I understand. The drop rate is relatively pretty good, and so you'll have a bunch of these if you play enough time during the season, so don't worry about wasting any of these. I wouldn't save them for the perfect time. As soon as you get one, I would use it, and I would use it on this weapon. So make sure that you have a Carlay's Point. If you need one, you can go to the blacksmith, and you can craft yellow rare daggers. Craft a level 70 yellow rare dagger, and you can take it to the cube, and you can upgrade it, and there's only 2 options. We'll see if we get it. In the queue, we go to recipe number 3, Hope of Cain, upgrade a rare item, fill it, drop your yellow rare in there, transmute it, and wouldn't you know, we got the other dagger. Oh well, but that's how you can get a Carlay's Point. And so once you get your Carlay's Point, what I would do if you're first starting out the season and you really haven't gotten that far yet, is go ahead and use this crucible on this weapon. And what these crucibles do is you can right click on it and then left click on an item, and you'll get a prompt, and it's going to tell you it's going to destroy this item. It's going to destroy this item completely, and it's going to give you another Carlay's Point, but this time it's going to have the same basic stats, but like this one, for example, has cold damage, dexterity, attack speed, resource cost, monster kills, grant experience. All of that stuff is going to re-roll as if you're getting a brand new item, but it's going to be a Carlay's Point, and it's not going to be a regular item. It's not going to be a non-ancient. It's not even going to be an ancient. It's going to be a primal ancient. And so just for comparison purposes, the reason why I would recommend using the crucible on this weapon is that if you compare this base weapon with an item that's already been sanctified, you can see that it's a 41.5% damage increase in this case. It's a huge damage increase. It's going to be the biggest bang for your buck. So definitely use it on a weapon. I would say that probably about any of the classes. Although you can use crucibles on any of your gear pieces. And so, for example, if you are lucky enough to find an ancient that's really good or a primal ancient Carlay's Point, then you can actually equip that. Don't waste your Sanctify on it, and use the Sanctify. A lot of people have been doing it on a holy point shot to make sure that you can get the specific stats that you want on this, which can be difficult to do. And that way you have 2 items that are very good. So in the long term in the season, you'll probably want to use the Crucible on a holy point shot. But in the beginning, and especially for casual players that aren't going to make it that far, just go with the weapon. It's going to be fine. And again, when you use a Crucible, it destroys the item, gives you a new one, and it's going to give you Primal Ancient stats, which is basically an ancient item with maximum stats. Now, the other thing that the Angelic Crucibles do is that they will not only give you Primal Ancient stats, but it will also add an extra legendary power. And the extra legendary power for each of the classes in Diablo 3, there's 3 powers that can be chosen, and it will add one of those 3 powers at random. So we're going to go ahead and use this consumable. I'm going to right click. We're going to left click on Carle's point. We accept it. It destroyed that item. It gave us a new one. And you can see that the stats are all different, but they're all at their maximum level, including the legendary power that comes with Carle's point. It's at the maximum 375%. And then you can see at the bottom there that there's an extra legendary power. And this is one of the 3 powers that can be rolled for Demon Hunter. In this case, Casting Vengeance unleashes a barrage of rockets. There's a whole paragraph there. That is actually not the power that we want. The power that we want is this one. Strafe now casts the last non-channeled hatred spinning ability cast. That is the one that we need. We have to have it in order for this build to work at all. So if you are unlucky enough, like we were, to not get the right power on your first roll, that's fine. You can, I guess, play the old Shadow Mantles build and still have a lot of impale damage available to you. Or you can play another set while you continue to farm items. And you can either find another Carle's point that you can use the Crucible on, or you can take this same item and use a Crucible on it again. And again, what it's going to do is destroy that item and give you a new one with new stats on it, including that extra legendary power. It's going to have the option to roll another one, and sure enough, we were lucky enough to get one. And actually, this is not a bad one. This is pretty good stats. I might hang on to this one. This one's similar. And so we were lucky enough to get this one. Like I said, Angelic Crucibles are something that drops fairly commonly. I've even seen them drop 3 together at the end of a Greater Rift in the loot pool. It's not very common to get 3, but I've seen 2. Oftentimes I'll have back-to-back-to-back Greater Rifts where I get 1 in each one of them. And so if you're unlucky in the beginning of the season, just keep on grinding away. You'll eventually get one. And just keep trying to sanctify the item until you get that Strafe legendary power. All right, so now we have our weapon with the right legendary power on it, and now we know that we're going to be using Strafe, which is a channeled ability. That's important to know because that's going to influence some of our gear choices. So now that we have our weapon, we'll take a look at the quiver. We want Holy Point Shot. The legendary power on this, Impale throws 2 additional knives, and they deal increased damage, perfectly syncing up with this set. We're using Impale. It's throwing extra Impales. They're doing more damage. That's awesome. So for the set itself, we're actually going to be equipping 5 of the 6 set pieces, specifically in the head, in the torso, the hands, the legs, and the feet slots. We're going to equip 5 of the 6 pieces, and that means in Kanai's Cube, we're going to have Ring of the Royal Grandeur assigned that reduces the number of items needed for set bonuses by 1. And so we're able to equip 5 of the pieces, yet still get the 6-piece set bonus. And what that does is it will free up the shoulder slot for us to be able to wear Mantle of Channeling. And since this is a channeling build, while channeling Strafe, we'll deal extra damage and we'll take less damage, perfectly syncing up with the playstyle. And then for the belt and for the bracers, we are going to use the brand new, hot off the press, as of the most recent patch for Season 27, the Guardians Jeopardy set. This is a new 3-piece set that they added. Since we're wearing Ring of Royal Grandeur in the cube, we can wear 2 of the items and gain the 3-piece set bonus. The 2-piece set bonus grants you extra toughness based on the amount of vitality and main stat that you have on your items. And then the big thing here is the 3-piece bonus, where you get an additional 100% of your base main stat, and you get 100% extra vitality. And this is specifically dexterity and vitality that's on your items in the base. And so, for example, when we're looking at this belt right here, we've got 628 dexterity that comes with the item, and we have an augment that's granting us 625 dexterity on top of that. I believe how it works is that the 628 dexterity is what is doubled. The augment is not doubled. And then that also applies to Paragon levels. This dexterity shown here is not doubled. It's only the base dexterity that comes on the item, but regardless, it's still very significant. And just to show you the difference, let's unequip these bracers. And now we don't have the 2 or 3 piece set bonus active. Let's take a look at the vitality side of things with the health, because that's a better visual. Right now in the base, I have 440,000 life, which is not very much. If we look at the bracers, it has 643 vitality, and it's only 1 piece of gear. So how much vitality is this going to add for us? Well, let's drop it on and find out. Boom. Look at that difference. We went from 440,000 to over 1 million health. That's pretty amazing. And you can also see this reflected in the damage and toughness numbers. You can see these numbers right here without the bracers, right? 15 million toughness and 2.3 million damage. Drop the bracers on, it jumps up, it skyrockets. Okay, so this is a very powerful set. Again, this is something brand new that they've added new for this season. Will be permanent part of the game from now on. Now, where do you get these items from? These do not drop from anything. You have to craft these at the blacksmith. You get the recipes for crafted items like this, mostly from bounty caches, I would say, is the main source. You can get them from some goblins, but usually you want to run bounties, get the caches at the end, you open them up, several recipes are going to drop, and you just need to keep running bounties until you get the recipe for the Guardian's Jeopardy set. And once you learn the recipe, it grants you the ability to craft all of the items within that set. And then for the amulet slot, we're going to use the very commonly used and popular Squirt's Necklace for an extra damage buff. And then for the ring slots, we'll be using Focus and Restraint, which is a 2-piece set which provides an extra 50% damage for using a resource generating attack, and then another 50% damage for using a resource spending attack. And then just to round out the gearing in Kanai's Cube, we'll be using a Dawn and the weapon slot that reduces the cooldown of Vengeance by a significant margin. And then in the armor slot, we'll be using Wraps of Clarity, which provides a toughness bonus for using a hatred generator. Now, while talking about the Guardian's Jeopardy 3-piece set, I did mention the Captain Crimson's 3-piece set. This is a very popular 3-piece set that's been used in a lot of builds recently, and it is actually very usable with this build if you want to mix things up a little bit. It's just a little bit of a different approach. I chose to use the Guardian set because I believe it's stronger out of the gate when you're first starting out the season, so this is the one I would recommend using. But this one also has a place even at the beginning of a season. So if you're looking to play this build early in the season and you haven't come across the plans for the Guardian's Jeopardy set, but you have found the Captain Crimson's, then just rearrange your items as necessary in order to equip this set. So the key thing here is that in the armor slot in Kanai's Cube, you either need Wraps of Clarity or Mantle of Channeling, and then craft whatever items that you need to fill in the holes around your 6-piece set of Shadow's Mantle. The Guardian's Jeopardy set has waist, wrist, and head. And then the Captain Crimson's is a little bit different. It has waist, but then it has legs and feet. So you can incorporate this 3-piece bonus instead of the Guardian's Jeopardy. I personally haven't played with Captain Crimson's with this build yet, so I don't know what it feels like relative to having Guardian's Jeopardy. My guess is that you will have less health overall out of your health pool, and so you might have to shift some Paragon points into health to give you some more cushion there. But the good thing with Captain Crimson's is that you're going to have a much easier time getting higher cooldown reduction, which is very important with this build, to have a certain amount of cooldown reduction. And if you can get even more, then you can have a little bit more cushion, and it can actually give you a little bit easier time playing with the set. So this might be a more relaxed version in some ways, but at the same time, you're going to have less health. So it's really not clear to me which one would be better per se. I think they're just different. So hey, try them both out and see which one you like better is my best recommendation. But like I said, so far I think this one's better. It's been working out great for me up to this point. Now, next, let's go over some of the properties on the gear. And like I just mentioned, cooldown reduction is the absolute most important thing that you want to prioritize. The reason for that is Vengeance. Vengeance has a cooldown in the base of 90 seconds, yet the duration is only 20 seconds. We want Vengeance to be permanently up all the time for two reasons. One is that we gain 40% increased damage while it's active, and with our rune choice, we gain 50% reduced damage taken. So huge damage output and toughness bonuses associated with this skill. We are highly motivated to have this active at all times. And what we need is a certain amount of cooldown reduction, and I believe the number that we're targeting is 37% shown in your character sheet right here. And how you're going to do that is, number one, you want to prioritize getting cooldown reduction in your Paragon points for this 10%. So as you're leveling Paragon, eventually, nominally, everybody's going to be 800 Paragon. When you're first starting out, try to prioritize putting points into cooldown reduction right here. And then next, you want to have a diamond equipped in your helm for an additional 12.5%. And then on your shoulders, you want to roll cooldown reduction there. So if you don't have it inherently, re-roll a property to have cooldown reduction. It is absolutely vital that you have it, so get it. And then on your gloves, same situation. Get cooldown reduction. Ideally, you want 8% on both of these pieces. I think you can get by with having maybe 6 or 7. You would have to play around with the numbers. The key thing is to get to 37 right here on the character sheet. So you have to play around with what you have and see what you're able to obtain. But get 8% on your shoulders eventually. Get 8% on your gloves. And then once you're there, you need one more item with cooldown reduction on it. And you can either get it on one of your rings, on either one. You could roll cooldown or have it rolled already on your quiver. You could even go with cooldown reduction on your weapon, which is what I currently have. And in theory, you could also have it on your amulet, but that is really not ideal because the damage stats on an amulet are really high and you wouldn't want to sacrifice those for cooldown reduction. I would say that your best option would probably normally be one of the rings to have cooldown reduction on if you don't already have it on your weapon or quiver. Now, in my case, I did have cooldown reduction on my ring and I had area damage on my weapon, but I decided that it was better for me to have the crit hit chance on the ring and to have the cooldown on the weapon, so I chose crit hit chance over area damage. The reason why I did that is because for me, I'm more of a single target type of player versus someone who's going to enter a greater rift and try to round up an entire map's worth of enemies to where I can really benefit a lot from area damage. And also just generally for lower level speed content, the crit hit chance is more valuable in terms of being able to produce more damage output. So like I said, in my particular case, I chose to go with cooldown reduction on my weapon in lieu of my rings and amulet, and also in lieu of my quiver. I was able to get critical hit chance there instead of trying to go for cooldown reduction, for example. Now, if you are strictly a solo player and you are never going to group with other people, especially with this build, then what you can do is take your Enchantress and select this Prophetic Harmony skill at level 20, which reduces skill cooldowns by 10%. So if I were to do that, I could take 10% cooldown here, and I could come back to my weapon and reroll this 10% cooldown back to area damage like I had it previously. And my cooldown reduction on my stat sheet would still be above the 37% breakpoint, and I would be able to keep Vengeance active all the time. So the main problem with taking this approach is that during multiplayer games, you don't have access to your follower, so you wouldn't have this extra cooldown reduction. That would drop you below your breakpoint, and then in multiplayer games, you wouldn't be able to have 100% uptime of Vengeance. And that feels bad, and that's not good. You could offset that by having a backup weapon or a backup ring or something, but then you got to start swapping out stuff, and I don't want to deal with that. So I just opted, in my case, to go with the increased elemental damage in lieu of cooldown on the follower, and I put cooldown on my weapon, and I just said that's the way things are going to be. I'm not as optimized and as good as I could be at solo greater rift pushing, but I'm okay with that. You don't have to be super optimized. The other problem with trying to do this with the follower is that in order to get to the 10% mark on skill cooldown, you have to have a lot of intelligence loaded in here. And you can see that I've got a lot of these pieces re-rolled on intelligence, which would take some crafty materials, if not a lot of crafty materials. And you can also see that I've got the max level gems and all these slots, which also takes a lot of materials to get to that point. And also you need intelligence. And so you would need a wizard or a witch doctor in the season in order to re-roll some of these items. That's not such a big deal because you can get items to drop on your demon hunter. And then you can just make a level 1 wizard or witch doctor and you can re-roll the items to get intelligence on them. But just the inconvenience and the time that it takes to gather up enough materials to do this, trying to target this early on in the season is just probably not a good idea. So anyway, bottom line, when it comes to the properties on your items, the absolute priority is to get enough cooldown reduction to be able to keep Vengeance active all the time. Next, on your items for your head slot, you're going to want to have crit hit chance and impale damage on your helm. On your boots, you want impale damage. On your quiver, you also ideally want impale damage. I haven't quite found a holy point shot that has enough stuff available, so right now I've got this extra socket on there in lieu of impale damage. Eventually, hopefully, I'll find one. You want crit hit chance, attack speed, dexterity, and then fire damage on your quiver. You also want fire damage on your bracers, along with 6 crit hit chance. And then on your amulet, ideally, you have fire damage, crit hit chance, and crit hit damage. With your amulet, though, and your rings, it can oftentimes be very difficult to get exactly what you're looking for, so I haven't quite found it. And then on your rings, you want crit hit chance and crit hit damage on both of these. Probably, ideally, you would want damage instead of dexterity, but that can be awfully hard to get sometimes, so I'm usually okay just having main stat dexterity with crit hit chance and crit hit damage on both of these. That's what I've got right now. And then of course on your gloves, you also want crit hit chance and crit hit damage. Coming back to the shoulders, we want an area damage roll in addition to the cooldown if we can get it. If we have to live with a defensive like armor, that's fine. And then on your torso and your belt and your pants slots, you go with the typical dexterity, vitality, armor, all resistance, life percentage. Just take whatever defensive toughness stuff you can get. And then on the weapon, of course, ideally you have main stat, you have damage percentage, and I think the way to go would be area damage normally. Like I mentioned, in my case, I'm using cooldown reduction just to be able to get to the breakpoint. Now, for legendary gems, first one that we've got is Bane of the Trapped, which is very typical for just about every build in Diablo 3 that gives extra damage output. Then we've got Taeguk. This is a channeling build. This is a channeling gem. After channeling for a few seconds, you're going to do a lot of extra damage, and then you also get extra toughness on top of that via armor. And then in the third gem slot, we're going all offensive on all these gems. We're selecting Zay's Stone of Vengeance, which deals extra damage to enemies based on how far away they are from you. This is great. This is exactly the type of gem that I want to use in this build. For me, I like to play this as a range style build. And so this is a perfect gem to use. I try to stay as far away as practical from things. And so I'm maximizing the benefits from this gem. And then for regular gems, like we mentioned in the helm, you want to have a diamond for cooldown reduction. You want to have an emerald in your weapon for critical hit damage. That's pretty standard for most builds. And then in the torso and pants slots, I would use dexterity gems, which is your main stat, to get extra damage. If you're having toughness problems, then it would be perfectly fine to swap these out for diamonds to get some extra resistance. I started out with diamonds in the beginning, but I don't even think that I needed them, to be honest. I noticed that I was surviving pretty well, so I pretty quickly swapped these with emeralds, and I haven't had any problems since then. Due to the playstyle so far, basically what I've observed is that if you're going to take damage, you're going to take damage, and it's going to hurt no matter what you do. And so you might as well just go all offensive. I think the diamonds, the extra toughness that you're going to get from that, isn't really going to significantly impact your gameplay that much. So next, let's take a look at the skills. In the number 1 slot, we're using Shadow Power. Like we've already seen, the 4-piece set bonus, Shadow Power gains the effect of every rune and lasts forever, so we would be foolish not to use this. Shadow Power in the base case grants some life per hit. And by the way, if you can get some life per kill on some of your secondary properties on your gear pieces, you'll benefit from some extra life per hit based on that. That's not something that I would target on secondary property. I would just view that as a nice to have if you get it. You're going to have plenty of life per hit in the base case anyway. You're going to have plenty of sustain, so I wouldn't worry about that. Now the runes for Shadow Power, this first one slows the movement speed of enemies within 30 yards by 80%. So the mechanic with this one is that this is not a passive thing. In order to benefit from this, you would have to manually press Shadow Power in order to slow the enemies around you, but we're not ever going to cast Shadow Power. We don't want to use the discipline on this skill. We want to save it for Smokescreen. So we're really never going to benefit from this. The next one, this doubles the total amount of life per hit gained. Great. Then the base, we get even more. Well of Darkness, this reduces the cost to 8 discipline. This is irrelevant, again, because we're not going to be casting Shadow Power more than one time. And then finally, we get into the good stuff. The Gloom Rune, this reduces damage taken by 35% while Shadow Power is active. So we get a big toughness boost all the time just from using Shadow Power. And then for Shadow Glide, we gain 30% increased movement speed while it's active. And this isn't too significant, but moving faster can help you get through nasty stuff a little better, like enemy affixes on the ground, and obviously just moving from pack to pack and moving around. The big thing here is the Gloom Rune. And it doesn't matter which rune you choose, just choose any of them because you get them all. The next skill that we have is Impale. Like we mentioned, Impale is our damage dealing attack. I will admit here, I'm not really sure which rune is the best one per se. I'm using the Fire Rune. I have read and heard that this is the best single target rune. This will deal the most damage. Impact is probably not good. It doesn't have any extra damage associated with it. The Overpenetration rune is cold damage, and it has the impales piercing through enemies in a straight line. This could be very good for high-end content in Greater Rifts where you're really grouping up a lot of enemies. I haven't tried this, mostly because I don't have the items for it. I was able to get items that had fire elemental damage on it. My amulet has fire damage. My bracers that I crafted have fire damage, and my quiver has fire damage. I didn't have to reroll any of that, so I actually don't have any of those pieces that have cold damage on it, so I can't even try it if I wanted to right now and push to a high level. But if you have pieces with cold damage on it, then you might want to try this out. And I think the same would go for Ricochet with Lightning. The knife ricochets to 2 additional nearby enemies within 20 yards of each other. And this Ricochet effect, I believe, is where on the 6-piece bonus, the subsequent enemies hit really comes into play. And I guess that comes into play on the Cold Rune as well, where you're piercing and you're bouncing the impels to other enemies. So it's not really clear which one of these would be better. I've heard that Grievous Wounds is not that good with the way the percent damage multiplier works. I don't know if it's additive, it's multiplicative. I don't know at what level that works at, but I've heard that this isn't that good. What I do a lot of times is I just look at the leaderboards and I see the people that are pushing up higher and higher, and I kind of just mimic their build a lot of times. I think that that's just a generally good tip for anybody. If you're wondering what's best in the moment, then you can look at that. The downside to that is if everybody is copying everybody else, then it kind of just feeds off of each other, and then you don't really know what actually is better because everybody's just doing what everybody else is doing. So again, I'm using Chemical Burn mostly because I saw it on the leaderboard one day and it's been working out fine for me. It definitely is good and it definitely works, I'll say that much. And then in the number 3 slot, we've got Vengeance. We've already talked about this, but Vengeance provides a 40% increased damage buff. And by selecting the Dark Heart rune, you get 50% reduced damage taken. This is too good to pass up. We've got to use it. And then in the number 4 slot, we have Bolas, which is a primary attack. The key thing here is that we need a primary attack, not to generate resource, but we need it to activate Raps of Clarity. Your Hatred generators reduce your damage taken by 50%. That's very significant. We have to have that Hatred generator to activate this, and to activate part of the Focus and Restraint buff. When you hit with a resource generating attack, you'll deal 50% increased damage. So those two things are the only reason why we need a primary generator attack. The reason why I'm using bolas with the Freezing Strike rune is, again, because I looked at the leaderboard and I saw some people using it. I tried it. It worked. I liked it. I didn't have a motivation to change it. So that's where I'm at. I think the key thing for me with playing this as more of a ranged build versus melee is that any of these might work. Hungering Arrow, Entangling Shot, and bolas are mostly all ranged as far as I know, unless one of their runes modifies it to not be. Evasive Fire, I believe, is more of a melee range type attack, so I don't think this would be good. Grenade could work, maybe. I think most of those are at range. I've liked the bolas so far with the Freezing Strike rune, mainly for 3 reasons. Number 1, bolas is ranged. Number 2, it shoots 3 bolas out. And so there's a little bit of extra coverage in case you aim at something and can't quite hit it exactly. You've got some backup attacks there with it with each cast. And then the third is pretty minor, but it, you never know, it could help you. Enemies hit have a 50% chance to be frozen for 1 second, which is basically just a little bit of help on defensive. When you look through the runes here, the Bitter Pill rune seems very interesting. It doesn't have the 3 bolas. It would have a single bola. But then you have a 15% chance to gain 2 discipline. And so that might have its place, especially as you're pushing in greater rift builds. The reason for that is your discipline level is going to be depleted when you use Smokescreen. You don't have a lot of discipline resource to start off with. I think in the base case you have 30 discipline, and that's going to be increased by your items if you have extra max discipline. But regardless, Smokescreen costs 14 discipline, and there's only so many times that you can use it before your discipline level gets depleted. And so this could be useful, although it is a very low percentage chance at 15%, and you're only gaining 2 discipline. And the way that the playstyle works out is that you're not casting bolas a lot. You're only casting it about once every 4 seconds. With 1 cast every 4 seconds at a 15% chance, just over time, you're not gaining that much discipline. So I haven't been really motivated to change to this rune, but again, it's something to consider. You might want to play around with that. This one seems to work out just fine for me so far, and I would keep an eye out on the leaderboards to see if people come up with something different to use. And next, of course, we need Strafe. This is another skill where I'm not exactly sure what rune is better. I saw people were using Rocket Storm rune. It's fire-based. I've got fire elemental damage on my gear. This shoots off extra homing rockets for weapon damage. That seems good. I think the reality with Strafe is that this is going to contribute very little, no matter which rune you select. It's going to contribute very little to your damage output overall because most of your damage is coming from Impale by far. So I don't know if this is really doing much. It could be worth it to play around with the Cold rune eventually. Leaving an Icy Trail chills enemies. That might help with some crowd control. You could have increased movement speed, although I did equip this earlier and try to play around with it. I don't think that you move any faster with this rune equipped. So I'm not sure if I just wasn't seeing it correctly or not, but Rocket Storm has worked out just fine for me so far. I haven't been motivated to change it, so that's what I'm running. And again, just to make sure it's clear, the Sanctified power on the weapon Strafe now cast our Impels. Ultimately, that is the reason why we need Strafe. And then last for the active skills, we have Smokescreen. And this is actually an extremely vital part of the build. This is something that if you don't have equipped, then you're going to have a really hard time surviving in higher level greater rifts as you're pushing up and testing your limits. What Smokescreen does is that it provides damage immunity for you for 1 second, for 1 whole second, which is basically no time at all. It's a very short duration. The good thing is that it provides damage immunity. The bad thing is that it only lasts 1 second. The good thing is that the cooldown is pretty short at 1.5 seconds. And then another downside is that it does cost 14 discipline. So like I mentioned earlier, I believe in the base case we have 30 discipline. And some of their items can roll with extra maximum discipline on the secondary property. This quiver has plus 12. I think the quiver and the weapon and the chest piece can all roll with a secondary property of additional discipline. And so I'm sitting at 42 right now. And knowing that this costs 14, there's only so many times that I can cast it. So I cast it, it lasts for 1 second. There's a 1.5 second cooldown. I can cast it again, on cooldown, cast it again, and then I've just regenerated enough to be able to cast it a 4th time, back to back to back to back. And again, that is with extra 12 discipline. Without this 12, I would only be able to cast it back to back 3 times and not 4. So looking at the runes, the rune choice that I went with is that since it only lasts for 1 second, which is not very long, I went with Lingering Fog, which increases the duration to 1.5 seconds, which is still not very long, but 1.5 seconds is a 50% improvement, which is a very large percentage increase. So I would not ignore that aspect. You might try to go with increased movement speed while you're invisible. You could argue that you could travel further ground and get through enemy affixes on the ground a little bit quicker, so you're actually able to travel further overall. The reason why I like the increased duration is that sometimes you're just trapped. I've been in some greater rifts where I've been fighting 2 packs of wallers and they've completely enclosed me in a space where I couldn't escape, and I had some nasty other ground affix at my feet. And so in those cases, I'm able to sometimes at least cast Smokescreen, have it last for the full 1.5 second duration. Hopefully I don't take too much damage and I can get out of there when the walls break. And another valid choice for the rune here is to take reduced discipline cost. In the base, it costs 14 discipline. This makes it cost 8 discipline. It's almost half the cost, which would translate over to being able to cast it almost twice as often. So there's definitely a case to be made here. But I've found that in general, when I need to cast this, it's when I'm in a tight spot and I need to get out. And if I can cast it once, twice, or 3 times to get myself out of an area into a safe location, that's usually sufficient. And I don't need to be spamming it 6 or 7 or 8 times. So Lingering Fog overall just seems like the better choice for me. Now let's go through the passive skills. The first one we take is Ambush. We deal 40% additional damage to enemies above 75% health. This is a very easy one to take from a standpoint of it's a passive damage increase that we always get. We don't have to worry about any requirements or funky mechanics associated with it. The next passive skill is Thrill of the Hunt. Enemies hit by your hatred spinders are slowed by 80% for 2 seconds. And the main reason why we take this is to activate the next passive, Cull the Weak, which increases damage against slowed enemies by 20%. Now you might think, why do I need Thrill of the Hunt? Can't I slow enemies via other means? And you'll remember the Shadow Power rune, Nightbane. This slows the enemies within 30 yards by 80%. But in order to benefit from this, we would have to activate Shadow Power, which cost ultimately, in our situation, 8 discipline. But we really can't afford using 8 discipline for this because we need to save it for Smokescreen. We're not going to be able to spam this often enough to benefit from it all the time. So that option is out. And we could say, well, what about Bane of the Trapped? We gain an aura that reduces the movement speed of enemies within 15 yards by 30%. So we could leverage that, but the issue here is that that is very tight melee range, the 15 yards, and we want to be further away from enemies. And just to give you a reference, this might be a little bit surprising if you've never seen this before, but a yard in Diablo 3 is not as long as it should be if you look at the size of your character. This waypoint area right here is a good reference. From the middle of the waypoint to the outer edge right here, that is 10 yards. The radius of this waypoint area is 10 yards. That would put a radius of 15 yards somewhere out in here. So we actually have to be pretty close to enemies to slow them with Bane of the Trapped, kind of in this area right here. And we don't want to be standing that close to them for multiple reasons. I don't want to get hit. I don't want to get a bunch of affixes layered on top of me from the elites. And I want to leverage Zay's Stone of Vengeance as much as possible. So I want to be further away from them than that. And that kind of backs up the choice of Thrill of the Hunt in your passives. So Thrill of the Hunt, Cull the Weak, they go together, combine for a damage increase. And then for our last passive skill, we take Steady Aim. As long as there are no enemies within 10 yards, all damage is increased by 20%. And again, 10-yard radius is an area about the size of this waypoint. So you might have been thinking 10 yards is far away and you really need to stay away from enemies. Not so much. You really don't need to be that far away at all in order to benefit from that passive skill. So we take Steady Aim and we'll virtually benefit from that almost all the time as long as we don't have enemies sitting right on top of us. Another thing with the passive skills is that when you look at the steady aim passive, instead of taking that one, a lot of people on the leaderboards have been taking numbing traps. Enemies you slow will have their damage reduced by 25% for 5 seconds. And so again, your Thrill of the Hunt passive skill is going to be slowing enemies. And then you could take numbing traps to reduce the damage that enemies are dealing to you, effectively increasing your toughness. I initially played with that passive, again, because I copied what was on the leaderboards and thought that it was necessary. But eventually, I discovered, due to the play style and how I was staying at range, that I wasn't really taking that much damage. And so I swapped this passive skill out for steady aim to pick up some more damage. And when I did that, I noticed virtually no change in my survivability and the amount of damage that I was taking. And so I went ahead and just stuck with the extra damage, which obviously is better. The more damage you can output, the higher greater rift level you're going to be able to do. But if you are running into issues where you feel like you don't have enough toughness, then you could definitely drop this passive skill and pick up numbing traps. And another thing that I've been thinking about recently that is definitely viable, and this would be particularly if you're playing a hardcore character, you could drop one of these passives like steady aim and pick up awareness, so that way you have an extra cheat death in addition to what your follower provides. That's something that I've thought about doing recently because occasionally I will get procced with the follower's cheat death skill, and during that time frame that is on cooldown, it would be nice to have an extra backup. But I haven't quite justified doing that yet, and I feel like losing out on the damage would hurt me more, and sometimes I feel like maybe I should just play better and avoid taking fatal damage. And of course, when you look at your passive skills, the steady aim passive by itself, assuming you have no enemies within 10 yards, which is pretty easy to do because that's such a short radius, all damage is increased by 20%. As far as I understand, that's 20%, and Call of the Week is 20%. But in order to benefit from Call of the Week, I actually need both of these passive skills. So to get 20%, I need both of these. To get 20% here, I only need one. So I'm contemplating even potentially dropping Call of the Week and Thrill of the Hunt, and maybe picking up numbing traps and awareness in these two slots, keeping steady aim and keeping ambush. So something that I might do just to experiment around with it and play with it. But so far, this seems to be working really well. I've been able to do pretty high greater rifts so far, and I've had a pretty enjoyable experience playing it in the process. So next, now that we've got the skills figured out and the gear, let's go through some of the play style mechanics. When you first enter a rift, you want to do this immediately. You're going to face roll some of your buttons. Number 1, cast Shadow Power. Just one time. Due to the 4-piece set bonus, Shadow Power will last forever. All we need to do is cast this one time, and we won't ever touch this button again unless we die. When you first enter a rift, or when you resurrect after dying inside the rift, you'll need to go through this button sequence to activate all your buffs. So cast Shadow Power, just hit it once, and then next you'll cast Impale manually. So Strafe will cast our Impales for us during the rift, but in order to get this set up correctly, we need to manually cast Impale, so it's in the left click slot. We're going to hold down Shift, and then we're going to hit left click, and that's going to cast Impale. And by the way, that's what Impale looks like. That's our knives being thrown out. Remember that the quiver adds 2 additional knives, so there's 3 total that get thrown out. It's a very important visual graphic to know what that looks like. This is what deals your damage whenever you're inside the Greater Rift. But when we enter the Rift initially, all we need to do is just cast that one time manually. And what that does is Impale costs Hatred, and it is a non-channeled spell. So when we look at our Sanctified item, Strafe casts the last non-channeled hatred spending ability that we cast, which is Impale. To make that sentence more succinct, Strafe now casts Impale. And that's what we need to do to activate that aspect. So once you do those two, you never need to do that again. Again, unless you die and resurrect. Don't forget to do it if you're resurrecting. And the next thing that we're going to do is cast Vengeance. Vengeance gives us extra damage increase, but it also gives us the toughness buff. And that's one of the reasons why we want to make sure that we cast this right away. And the horizontal bar on top of the skill is the duration, and the radial arm here, like a stopwatch going around on a clock face, that is the cooldown. And you'll see the cooldown expired right before the duration. We'll do it again so you see it. We've got the cooldown rotating around, and then it's going to flash whenever it's expired. And we can watch this duration on this horizontal bar. We know we're good. We know we're good. We know we're good. We've got our toughness benefit. Cooldown is expired. Buff duration's expired. So there's a very small window there where you will need to refresh Vengeance. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. But the key thing right now is up front, immediately when you enter a rift, make sure you hit Vengeance to get that toughness buff going. And then next, right after that, we're going to cast Bolas by hitting number 4. And that's going to activate the Wraps of Clarity buff. And this one only lasts for 5 seconds. So we talked about all these skills in length about how you need to activate them. The reality is that when you enter a rift, this is going to take you all of 1 second to do. You just enter, you're going to hit 1, 3, 4 and left click. All in succession. You immediately do that so that your toughness buffs are up. So that way when you encounter that very first enemy, you don't get one-shotted. It would feel really bad if you died right out of the gate, and it is very easy if you don't have your toughness buffs up. Remember, you get toughness from Shadow Power, you get toughness from Vengeance, you get toughness from Bolas. A lot of extra toughness. Next, after you activate all your buffs, you're going to start strafing. You just hold down right click and you start spinning around and you get to your enemies. Now what we can't simulate here outside of the rift is that while you're strafing, it costs hatred. And you could see the hatred level going down very quickly. This is where this legendary power, the base legendary power on Carle's Point, is extremely important. Impale will return 15 hatred if it hits an enemy that's already been hit by Impale. So in order to regenerate hatred in this build, while you're strafing, your Impales need to hit an enemy, and then that same enemy needs to be hit again with subsequent Impales. Now, if you are playing this build on too low of a difficulty, where you're so powerful that you are one-shotting everything, then you are never going to have a chance to regenerate hatred. And it's going to feel bad, and you're not going to like playing with this build. So this is kind of a weird thing where you have to increase the difficulty of the monsters that you're playing against in order for the build to even be viable. Because what will happen is that you'll be one-shotting everything, your hatred level is getting depleted, and just like that, we're out. And now we're not spinning, but we're sputtering around, barely casting, and therefore not casting impels, therefore not dealing damage. And like I said, it feels bad. Not fun. So if you're running into that problem, you need to increase the difficulty, increase the level of your greater rifts that you're playing in, and just get more health on those monsters so it's taking multiple hits to take them down. And at some point, if you're climbing up the torment levels playing this build, at some point you're going to hit torment 16. And at some point you're going to start one-shotting those monsters in torment 16. And at some point this build will just not be viable at torment 16 because you've just outgrown it, you've gotten too powerful. So I'd highly recommend not using this build for Torment 16, for doing Nephilim Rift farming, for doing bounty content, for basically doing anything outside of Greater Rifts, unless you purposely nerf yourself down to where you're generating resources off the attacks. Now, when you're in a Greater Rift where you know the monster difficulty level is high enough to where it's taking multiple hits to take them down, you've been staying at maximum hatred level, and you find all of a sudden, wait a minute, my hatred level is depleted. Usually what that means is that you died, you resurrected, and you forgot to cast Impale manually, and your strafe isn't casting Impale. And so just wait for your resource level to generate a little bit, enough to get 20 hatred, and cast Impale again. And then, of course, another reason why you might run out of hatred is because you're traveling from point A to point B. There's no monsters along the way. You're sitting there holding strafe down. In those moments, don't worry about strafing, just manually run. You'll drop your Taeguk stacks off, but those will quickly regenerate. Just be careful when you approach the next group of enemies. So next, let's talk about some basic positioning of where we want monsters to be relative to us. Let's take this gentleman right here. Let's assume that he's some big, bad, nasty elite. Now, for a build like Whirlwind Barbarian or Tempest Rush Monk, what you're going to do is you're going to get up in his grill, and you're going to be hitting him with your melee attacks. You're going to be spinning around him like this. With this build, we don't want that. We want to be very far away. We want to be as far away as we can. We want to be way back here, spinning around over here for multiple reasons. One, we don't want to take damage. It's much easier to avoid damage if we're far away from things. We're not going to get hit with melee attacks. projectiles from elites and other monsters, it will be directionally much easier to dodge them and move out of the way. We're going to be constantly on the move, strafing around, so we're going to be ready to dodge things. And then plus, one of the biggest motivators is we want to leverage Zaystone of Vengeance damage increase. And the further we are away from enemies, the more we're going to benefit from this. And also, we want to benefit from steady aim. Although, like we mentioned, 10 yards really isn't that far, but we do generally want to stay away from things. And plus, I prefer to play this as a ranged spin-to-win build. You can do it up close. I know people have done that. It can help you target higher priority monsters like elites much better. You can make sure your impales are hitting that specific target. Sometimes elites, they'll summon little smaller enemies and they'll get between you and the elite. And now all of your impales will be damaging that trash. You won't be doing damage to the elite, which is the higher priority target. And so it can be sort of frustrating to be at range. But I've found so far that we can still complete Greater Rifts just fine at range. I like the playstyle, so that's what I would recommend you do. Now, how you want to move about, that is very important because you need to create kind of a rhythm to how you're refreshing these two buffs, your Vengeance and your Bolas buffs. The simplest way to think about this for me is that you're constantly on the move while strafing. And so I will tend to go in circle patterns like this, or in semicircle patterns back and forth like this while I'm strafing. I'll try to do it with strafe. So we're strafing around, there's one full circle, there's two full circles. Or you might travel in some semicircles like this, which I think I do this more often than a full circle. And the reason why I do that is because we're forced to stay on the move, and I generally want to be in the same area while I'm fighting an enemy. And a lot of times we're stuck in like a smaller, narrower hallway, or I'm trying to shoot through a doorway, so I really don't have freedom of movement. You could go back and forth like this, but then either you would have to go back and forth a lot, and I don't like doing that with my mouse in my right hand. It just puts too much strain on me. And so I like the smoother circular options that's much more sustainable long term for me. And I don't like going back and forth too much because if you get too far away, you get out of range of your strafe and your impale throws. And then of course, if you get too close, then you're too close for your Zaystone of Vengeance. You're closer than you need to be. And what I've found is that as I'm circling around, what I'm going to do is whenever I'm lined up facing the target that I'm trying to attack, I'm going to hit Bolas and the number 4. And what that does is that refreshes my buff. And so I'm going to go around in a circle, and I'm lined up with them. I'm going to hit number 4. Now I've got Wraps of Clarity refreshed. You can watch it right there as I spin around, as I move around. Bolas when I'm facing the enemy. Bolas when I'm facing. Do one circle, or you do a half a circle, come back, and just kind of alternate either side like that. And you're going to find that rhythm, and you're going to get comfortable with it. There's a bit of that cadence there. And now, once I start doing that, I don't need to look down and monitor this buff anymore because I'm casting Bolas often enough to where my toughness bonus is active all the time and my focus and restraint buffs are active. And the important thing why I line up the Bolas shot with the enemy is that I have to hit something with Bolas in order to activate this. Remember that. You can fire Bolas into nothing to activate Wraps of Clarity, but it's not going to activate Focus and Restraint. So I'm just going back and forth like this most of the time. I might do full circles, but every time I rotate back around, I'm casting Bolas to refresh Wraps of Clarity. Now, ideally, you're only casting Bolas right before that expires. So if you're spinning around in a circle, you might try to make it 2 laps. If you do tight enough circles, you can make that work. Do 2 circles around. But I've found in general, I like to do 1, usually semicircle, a little bit wider. And I'm casting it at about the halfway mark. And what that does for me too is that it sort of ensures that I'm casting it often enough. The reason why you want to optimally cast it right before the expiration is that hitting Bolas does interrupt your strafing, which will interrupt your damage output. So you don't want to cast it too often. If you're strafing and you just start holding down Bolas, you're just going to sit there casting Bolas all the time. Now, once you understand that and you kind of get into that groove of casting your Bolas every few seconds, Now I'm not having to look down at it. It's just something that's naturally happening. I'm paying attention to what's on the screen. I'm not looking at this icon anymore. What about Vengeance? Well, what we can do is every time I hit number 4, after that, I immediately hit number 3. I've got my index finger hitting number 4, and then immediately hitting number 3. So I'm spinning around, line up with the enemy, 4-3. Spin around, 4-3. Spin around, 4-3. And that's what I do. That's the groove. Usually in semicircles, spin around 4-3, spin around 4-3. And what this does for us is now we're mindlessly refreshing Vengeance in addition to the bolus. Now the dangerous part is that if it doesn't time up exactly, then the worst case, if we're refreshing Wraps of Clarity buff, if we're hitting bolas every 4 seconds at least, then at worst case scenario, Vengeance will be down for 4 seconds. So that's not great, but it's better than nothing. It's better than having to manually keep track of it, again, so I can keep track of what's on the screen and I don't have to look down here at the duration bars for my buffs. Now, of course, for Vengeance, like we mentioned earlier, I think this is the only duration bar that you really need to pay attention to. So once you get more comfortable with the build, you can actually start to glance down and see this duration bar. And as you know it's getting closer, you don't need to look at the cooldown ticking down to see if that's going to be available. You know that once this gets to 0, this is going to be available. So you can just keep track of this duration bar. And when it gets lower, you know, okay, I need to start refreshing Vengeance, and you might sit there and spam the button. Okay, you're in your zone, you're hitting 4-3, 4-3. You might just decide, okay, I'm going to watch that for a few seconds there at the end, and I'm going to refresh it manually. But for the most part, I rarely do that. I'm just hitting 4-3, spinning around 4-3. Depending on your comfort level, what you can do is while you're in this pattern of hitting 4-3, doing a semicircle 4-3, you can actually tap 3 multiple times. As many times as you're wanting to do it, really. And that just comes down to a comfort level with your hand and how much stress you want to put on it and kind of what you find comfortable and fun. So I don't usually do this, but in theory, this would keep Vengeance up a little bit more. It would prevent you from having it drop off completely. So you can try that. All right, so just a couple more things on Vengeance. We've obviously talked extensively about the importance of this buff, rightfully so, because it gives such significant damage output and toughness bonuses, and you have such a small window to keep it refreshed. So we talked extensively about getting into the groove with your 3-4 dance. That's going to be great to help you ensure that you're keeping it active over the course of the entire rift. And we've also mentioned that the duration bar is something that you can glance down at and kind of monitor over time. That's something that I highly recommend you try to get into the habit of doing, just because it's an extra layer of protection to make sure that you're paying attention to Vengeance and you're refreshing it. But the reality is that when you're inside the Greater Rift, there's going to be all kinds of stuff going on that you're going to have to pay attention to. There's going to be all these different colors and sound effects. There's going to be all these different types of enemies and projectiles coming at you. You're going to be worried about your positioning. You're going to be worried about doing damage to the right enemy. You're going to be trying to avoid damage. You're going to take damage. You're going to be worried about, you're going to be trying to regenerate your health and using your health potion and using smoke screens. So the bottom line is that you're going to be under duress. And even though you're going to try to maintain your 4-3 cadence, the reality is that that subconscious, unconscious level, you may lose it because you're paying attention to so many other things and you're trying to process so much. So you're going to need some practice to do that. But a couple more things on top of that to maybe try to help you out is when you cast Vengeance, you'll notice that your character turns this dark blue, sometimes purplish looking color. Now, unfortunately, you can only really see this whenever you're not strafing. But if you're running from point A to point B and you notice that your character is not that color, that means Vengeance dropped. And that can be a reminder, hey, I need to cast Vengeance. Another thing is that while you're strafing without Vengeance active, you can see and also hear how that looks and sounds. This is strafe without Vengeance active. And this is strafe with Vengeance active. You'll notice that when you're using the Dark Heart rune for Vengeance, it's lightning based, so when it's active, Vengeance is actually going to be shooting out its own rockets, which are sort of this blue color. So while we're strafing with Vengeance, you'll be able to see those rockets emanating outwardly from us. Those blue projectiles leaving are from the Vengeance skill. So if you're strafing and you no longer notice that those rockets are being fired outwardly from you, then that is a sign that Vengeance is not active and you need to refresh it. And you can also hear the difference in the sound effects. So as you play this more and get more experience with it, you're going to be able to pick up on these video and audio cues. And that's just another layer of protection on top of what you're already doing to help you out. So now that we have our cadence, if we're attacking this monster right here, most likely he's not going to stay stationary and he's going to start creeping towards us. And so what we're doing with our semicircles is we're going to be backing up, rotating around, and we're slowly backing out away from him as he's approaching us. And he's just going to keep on coming for us. And we're going to stay at range. We're going to keep through our cadence. And then once we've backed down a hallway or backtracked where we've came from, and now the elite may be over here, what we're going to do is strafe through them and get to the other side. So after we've run through the elite, we're going to backtrack. We're not really backtracking. We're moving forwards now through the rift back to where we were originally. And then if we need to do it again, we'll pass back through that elite and we'll back up and we'll kind of keep them in that same area. And once we get them to low health, then we can start to pull more monsters in the forward area and start to aggro more and collect more in a group. And of course, too, while we're doing this in the circle or semicircle method, occasionally we're going to get Oculus Ring procs from our follower. You should be on your follower wearing the Oculus Ring. You should have this as close to 85% as possible. The stats don't matter other than just getting intelligence if you're using the Enchantress. Get that to 85%, has a chance to create an area of focus power. And that area of focus power is going to be roughly the size of this waypoint area. So it might actually be a 10-yard radius. And when those spawn, they spawn these little yellow golden circles. We'll see those in the Greater Rift we do. You're going to sit there and you're just going to go around in the circle and keep your 4-3 cadence going. And while you're in there, you're going to be getting an extra 85% damage. So wherever Oculus Rings spawn, you want to try to stand in them where you can, especially if they're at range. If you have something that's really close to an enemy, I would recommend probably not going for it, mostly from a standpoint of you don't want to take excess damage while you're standing there. You usually can't tolerate it, and it's best to stay at range and avoid projectiles and to keep your benefits from Zaystone of Vengeance going. But if you do have an enemy that's low on health and there's an Oculus Ring nearby and you can jump in it to kill them off quickly before you move on. And lastly, we need to talk about smokescreen. So let's say we're backing up, we're strafing, there's an elite coming for us, and now we've backed ourselves into a corner. We don't have any way to escape except for right here, and here's an elite. And he just casted a bunch of molten, poison, arcane beams on us in here. What you want to do is get out. Pop smokescreen and run. And get out. Okay? That is the situation where you want to use smokescreen and you want to save your discipline for that. You want to be as defensive as you reasonably can be with smokescreen. Again, it doesn't last very long. It's only a second and a half, and it would only last a second if you choose a different rune. But again, you're in here working it. You've got the arcane beams. You see something nasty get summoned, hit smokescreen and get out. And the beautiful thing is that even though you can't get very far, the cooldown is so short that now you can cast smokescreen again and maybe get through another affix or two, and then you can do it again. You should be at least able to do it 3 times, and you can see that we covered some pretty healthy distance. And so you'll want to use that pretty defensively like that, and once you escape a pretty nasty area, don't try to go back in that area because your discipline level will be pretty low after using the skill a few times. And so you want to kind of hang back, again, stay at range, fight the enemies from range, be conservative, let your discipline level increase, and then once it does, then you can be a little bit more aggressive and get back in the fight a little bit more and try to get better positioning. Maybe you're trying to move forward past an enemy. Now, my recommendation is to mostly use it from a defensive standpoint. You can use this from an offensive standpoint a little bit. For example, if you have an Oculus Ring that's spawned right next to an enemy, you can rush into it, and if they have some nasty affixes in the area, you can hit smokescreen while you're spinning around in it. And even though it doesn't last very long, it does last some time, and you can spam it back to back to back, depending on your maximum discipline level. So you can get a few seconds worth of Oculus Ring damage by doing that. But if you treat it as more of an offensive skill like that, then you need to have an exit plan. You need to be able to get out of there and not have to rely on smokescreen to get you out. So next, let's just go through quickly the Pylon strategy to see if there's anything special about this build. For a channeling pylon, those aren't too helpful. We already stay at maximum full resource with hatred. One thing that it can do is it will help ensure that vengeance will stay active because the cooldown will be reduced so significantly, and we'll be hitting 4-3, 4-3 so much that it will always be active during your channeling pylon. But again, that's not too significant because it's already going to be mostly active anyway. You could spam smokescreen more often so you can be a little bit more aggressive with it like we just described. You might decide to try to sit in an Oculus ring, or you might stay a little bit more aggressively in an area with a bunch of affixes. But the problem with that is that channeling pylon will help your cooldown reduction, so there's still a window where you can take some damage, and you can take fatal damage very quickly during that window, so I really wouldn't recommend it. Channeling pylon isn't that great. Speed pylon is also not great. I don't know if it's actually extra damage output. It gives you increased attack speed and movement speed, and it might increase your damage output. If it does, I've never really noticed it, so it's not very significant, whatever it is. The speed pylon does make you move faster, which can be beneficial, but if you're in this cadence like we're describing of circling around and hitting 4-3 in a certain mode, if we're moving faster, we're going to get through our patterns a lot quicker, and that can actually throw us off of our rhythm. And so it's one of those, I'll take the speed pylon for the extra elite pack, but the movement speed isn't fantastic. And probably the worst thing about the extra movement speed is because we're always having to move with strafe, we can't just sit still. When we're moving faster, it makes it harder to dodge projectiles and to position ourselves amongst the enemy affixes. We can't really fine-tune that as well, so it's usually a bit of a relief when that speed buff drops. But like I said, I'll take the extra elite pack from the pylon itself. And remember, your followers should be using Nemesis bracers so that those pylons will spawn that enemy champion. The conduit pylon, the one that shoots out lightning, that is just as strong as any character, and you want to take that. It's very powerful. The key thing with the conduit pylon is that ideally, when we're strafing, we're staying at maximum range from the enemy. But with the conduit pylon, we actually need to get in a little bit closer to make sure the lightning strikes can reach enemies, because if you're too far away, it's just not going to shoot anything. So during the conduit pylon, just make sure that you're a little bit closer to enemies to spread out the lightning bolts and strike as much as you can. For power pylons, there's not much of a difference. You're going to do, I believe it's double damage. It's at the very least increased damage. The only thing I can think of there in terms of tips is that you can tend to be a little bit more aggressive in staying in Oculus rings for a little bit longer. And I say that from a standpoint of if you're fighting an elite and there's an Oculus ring proc and you've got the power pylon, you can jump in there and do a tremendous amount of extra damage and kill that elite off before they really have a chance to set up a bunch of affixes on the ground. So you can be a little bit more aggressive from that standpoint before they have time to do much damage back to you. And then lastly, for the shield pylons are great for this build whenever you're using Squirt's Necklace. So the Squirt's Necklace, again, while you're not taking damage dealt is increased by up to 100%. So during a shield pylon, you're not taking damage. These stacks down here are going to build up to 10, and you're going to be doing that maximum 100% extra damage. Since you're not taking any damage, if there's an Oculus ring, you can go sit in it, and now you're doing Squirts damage, you're doing Oculus ring damage. You don't have to worry about dodging stuff. You're just sitting there in the middle of a pack. Wherever the Oculus ring is, I go into it. I don't worry about trying to stay at range. I get in close. Usually the Oculus rings are going to be inside a large pack of enemies, and I'm trying to get close to elites to try to take them down, which I really can't do at range because, like I mentioned earlier, the elites oftentimes will stay back, and there's going to be some trash monsters in between that you're going to have to work on. I don't want to spend time during my shield pylon doing that. I try to get in close and just sit in that Oculus ring, and I forego the Zay Stone of Vengeance buff, but usually it's better to try to focus down the elites. And remember also with your follower, you should be wearing the Flavor of Time that increases the pylon effects to twice as long. And so I believe the shield pylon lasts 1 minute in the base case, and with that Flavor of Time equipped, it'll last twice as long, which is 2 minutes. So you'll get double the time with 100% damage from squirts and all that time in Oculus ring procs. So we've gone over just about every element of this build. Now let's go into a greater rift and see how this actually plays. I will say up front, I want to make it very clear that I am not an elite player by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not super skilled like a lot of people that are pushing the leaderboards at a really high level. I do have very good gear on. I'm at a relatively high Paragon level at over 1400. Do have the ancient weapon with Carlay's point being sanctified. I have a relatively very good holy point shot. I've got good items all around. Every single item is ancient except for this ring and this amulet. All of the ancient items have a 125 augment on them except for this one, which is a 135. My legendary gem levels are all right now at 138. With this build, I was able to complete a Greater Rift level 137. At the time that I completed it, it was good for rank 10 on the leaderboards, which is very unusual for me. I'm usually not pushing very high. It's not an objective that I have whenever I'm playing in a season. I just play to enjoy it. I collect ancient items, I try to augment all my gear pieces, and I just go as high as I can go within reason. I am not an elite player from a standpoint of understanding greater rifts and knowing the different map types and mob types and pylon locations. So I say all that to tell you that what you are about to see me do in this rift, you can totally do it as well. All you would need is to collect the ancient items and get the augments and get a reasonably high Paragon level, which is very easy to do whenever you are very powerful. It's just a matter of a little bit of time to play the game and farm enough Greater Rifts to get there. So given that I was able to complete a Greater Rift 137 with a little bit over 2 minutes left, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drop that down to a level 135. I like to do Greater Rifts that aren't absolutely pushing my limit because whenever I walk into a Greater Rift, I like to complete it. I like to get my legendary gem levels up, and I don't want to be super stressed in the process. So let's do a Greater Rift 135 and see what this looks like. Again, when you first enter, face roll your buttons. 1, 3, 4, left click, start strafing. And get immediately into your groove of tapping 4, 3, 4, 3, hitting bolas. We haven't encountered any enemies yet. That's okay, we'll get there. We were out on hatred, we encountered an enemy, we strafed a little bit, and we were immediately able to refill our hatred level. This isn't a great map because the area isn't wide open. These narrow hallways are really tight. It's going to be hard to group up enemies, but we are staying at range. We're spinning around in our circle, hitting 4, 3, 4, 3. And that's all we do. We refresh Vengeance right there. You can see our Squirts buff stacks right here. They're increasing. That means we're not taking any damage. Trying to avoid the projectiles they're throwing at us. Got to try to avoid that poison. And this elite is really backing us up. So what I'm going to do is circle around him. And now I'm going to move forward. And have him back up with me the other direction. There's crazy amounts of damage with this build. We're just trying to stay at range, maximize our Zay's Stone of Vengeance. There we go, took him down. I do quite a poor job of making sure that Vengeance is always up, you'll notice. Yet, I still survive. You can do it too, believe me. This trash right here, normally I think most people would just run through it. We deal so much damage that I like to take this out, and plus I like to leave me some room to work with behind me for the next elite pack, which is right here. Just circling around, very chill build. I don't have to really worry about too much. Our Squirts necklace stacks are increasing again. Here's a good Oculus ring. We might be able to sit in here for a little bit of time. It's a little bit of a trade-off because we went in and took some damage. Now we've got this elite. I'm going to pass through him and attack him from the other side. When I ran through him right there, I did tap Smokescreen, which is a great time to do it, just to avoid taking any kind of unnecessary melee hits. Or if you have to run through these affixes, use Smokescreen to get through it and don't take any damage. Okay, right there we took a little bit of damage. We just need to back out, get to some clear space, and keep on firing. You can see the impale animation. Those 3 impales leaving. Whenever we're strafing, whenever we're in range of enemies, those impales are automatically flying out. Here's our first pylon. Gonna go ahead and grab it. Whenever we open up the pylon, it's a good idea to tap smokescreen first, open up the pylon so you don't take any damage, and move out of the area. You can tap smokescreen right before, would be ideal, or you can try to do it right after. Either way, just be prepared to get walloped. And this is a power pylon. We're going to do a lot of damage with this. You'll notice so far I've killed pretty much everything. Not really skipping anything too much. At the higher greater rifts, you do need to push through and skip some of this trash. I do like to push through sometimes to leave some things behind me. In the event that I do need to backtrack, then I can kill those off when I backtrack. Gives me some extra something to attack. But mainly the motivation with this build is you do want to be fighting elite packs. I think that would be true just for about every build. Okay, ran through those enemies. I used smokescreen to get through. Didn't see anything interesting downstairs, so I'm going to move on. Scorch buff is up, so I'm trying to maintain it. Couldn't dodge those fireballs, it looked like. Here's another elite. I'm going to use smokescreen to come in here. I was getting some heat. And Frozen Pulse. This is great. Frozen Pulse is the absolute bane of my existence with this build. I don't know if I've just had bad luck with it, but I've warped into those like rubber banded on my screen. I don't know if it's a lag issue or if it's just due to the nature of Strafe is always moving and I don't perfectly sync up with the pulse exactly. So make sure you stay on the move when you see those frozen pulses and get out of the area. There was a great example of me taking damage. We took fatal damage right there and we procced our cheat death from our follower. So now we want to be extra careful. Try to hang back, stay at range again. Keep doing your little circles. 4-3, 4-3. Taking some damage here. There's another frozen pulse. I'm going to use smokescreen to come through everything, get on the other side. Oh, perfect. Here's an Oculus ring. We're going to hang out in here. Another frozen pulse. I use smokescreen to run away from it. Got the elite down. As we're running through this trash, here's this Oculus ring. We can set in this. I'm not too afraid of the enemies right now that are throwing things at me. There's not too many of them. I'm surviving so far, so I'm feeling pretty good. I don't normally like to be taking hits like that. But we're holding even on progression, and we've already had a power pylon. So this is a good place to be, relatively, holding even for the moment. We're going to need a conduit pylon and or our shield pylon, though, to really push ahead. Here's another elite. We're going to try to stay at range. There's arcane beam, so we're going to back up. I don't want to deal with that. While the elites are walking forward, we're going to work on this trash back here to keep making some progression. Going to try to hang out in this Oculus ring. There's another arcane beam. I'm going to fall back a little more. Even back here, the impales are still shooting out. So we're still doing a lot of damage. We're basically at our maximum distance. So Zay's Stone of Vengeance is at its maximum. Here comes some more arcane beams. I don't want to mess with any of that. We got squirts at 10 stacks. We're in a pretty good place right here. I'm going to sneak into this Oculus ring. Where'd everybody go? They all died. So now I'm going to move forward. There's only this one elite left. I'm going to go see what else is over here. Here's a speed pylon. I'm going to go ahead and take it and fall back. I didn't use smokescreen before I popped it. I used it a little late as I was running away. But get out, avoid damage. This is the speed pylon where we're running really quickly, so it's going to be a little bit harder to make really tight circles. We're going to have to kind of adjust the shape of how we turn our mouse. Circle around, 4-3, 4-3. Throughout this whole rift, I have yet to glance down to look at my vengeance buff duration. I'm not proud of that. But that goes to show you that you don't need to look at it. If you keep your rhythm going with 4-3, then you should be okay. Alright, I'm going to skip to this next level, since there wasn't any more elite packs there. We have squirts at 10 stacks again. I'm going to try to milk it for what it's worth. Try to kite everybody around here. Now, one thing I didn't mention is that I can do the little tiny circles and stay in one spot, or I can do the semicircles. In larger open areas, I'll actually travel around a larger pack of enemies like this, and I just need to periodically turn in and fire 4-3 at them to keep the buffs active. That kind of helps keep things grouped up. It helps me to avoid enemy affixes. I can kind of stay out of the area. See that thunderstorm to the left there? I'm going to come over to the right. If he wants to cast any more affixes at me, like these mortars, the portal. You'll notice that when I'm fighting this single enemy, several of the impales, basically 2 of the 3 that shoot out, are completely missing him when I'm at range. So it can be worthwhile to move into melee range when you find yourself in this situation. You're going to give up Zaystone of Vengeance and the steady aim passive skill damage most likely, but the trade-off is that you would be able to hit them, hopefully with more than just one impale at a time. Kind of tough, but we got him down. We're still holding even. It's really looking like we're going to need that conduit or shield pylon to be able to push ahead. Hopefully we get it. Okay, we are traveling around in a larger circle, firing into the pack periodically. 4-3, keeping our buffs active. I'm going to come down here. This is a little dangerous. I'm going to hit smoke screen to run through this and kind of backtrack. Just aggroing more, kind of scouting ahead. Here's an Oculus ring at range. This is perfect. We can set in this as long as it's up. We've got squirts up. Kind of pulled ahead on progression. We're doing okay. Here's arcane beams. I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to use smoke screen to come to the other side of these guys. Sometimes when I pass through an elite pack like that, ooh, smoke screen. Took damage, hit smoke screen. When I pass through an elite pack, I'll try to focus down some of this trash. Hit smoke screen to get out of all that, and I'll come back. I try to focus down little smaller individual enemies so that I can create some space. We took a big hit right there, and we got procced again with our follower cheat death. We're still doing okay. This elite's almost down. There he goes. Use smoke screen to run through all that and pick up the orbs. You'll notice our discipline level is awfully low, so I need to be a little bit more conservative with smoke screen. I'm going to push ahead a little bit. I'm going to hit smoke screen right here, get past these guys. I'm hoping for a pylon to spawn at some point. If we can get it, we'll pretty much have this in the bag. There's a lot of damage right there. I was kind of being a little bit risky sitting in that Oculus ring, even for the couple of seconds that I was there. I'm not going to attempt to sit in that one. It's not going to be worth the extra damage that I'll take. Just kind of moving around, trying to stay smooth with the circles. I hit smoke screen right there to run through all that was headed toward me. And here's our conduit pylon. Not even going to waste time. Hit smoke screen after you pop it. And now we've got to try to stay a little bit close to enemies, more so than usual. Be careful with the affixes. Try to stay close to the bigger elites. If it gets too hot like that right there, then don't feel bad about falling back. I want those orbs. I'm going to have to wait for all this stuff to clear. There we go. There was 2 packs in there. And now we have the Rift Guardian. You're going to see how much power this has. Remember, we're doing a Greater Rift 135. We do not have Bane of the Stricken. We do have Conduit, so it's a little bit tough to tell. But even without Conduit, we would be absolutely destroying this guy. Just circling around him, trying to avoid his projectiles. We're at 10 stacks on Squirt's necklace. Got less than a minute left. Don't panic. Just stay the course. Don't forget to use smoke screen, especially if you have the discipline available. Don't sit in one spot too long. Try to stay on the move. Don't want those projectiles to be coming towards you and hitting you. And there we go. Super non-optimized, non-perfect, non-ideal Rift, and probably mob types perhaps, but we were able to clear it. And with that, we'll wrap it up. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comment section. I hope that you found something useful, and I hope you enjoyed playing with this build. And as always, if you enjoyed the guide and would like to see more content, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.